I'm sure people will continue to trickle in for a minute, but let's dive in. So first of all, welcome folks. Today we're going to be talking about guardrails and Kubernetes. I have a very few handful of slides, and then we'll have a brief demo at the end for some software that Fairwinds is building that's relevant to the space, but we're going to be mostly just talking through a whole bunch of questions about Kubernetes guardrails and how these folks think about it. But let's go ahead and dive in and start with introductions. So I'm going to stop sharing there. And by way of introduction, first of all, my name is Kendall Miller. I'm president at Fairwinds. We are a Kubernetes company. So we've been in business 6.5 years. And I'll tell you a little bit more about Fairwinds, but all we've done is Kubernetes for the vast majority of that. And excited to be here and moderate. Aaron, you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Aaron Friel. I go by my last name among friends, so feel free on this panel to call me Friel. And I've been at a mental health startup in the Bay Area for about 3 years. I was the first engineer there, and have been principally involved in choosing our technology up to this point.
Principally involved, meaning involved as a principal engineer, or meaning every time something fails in the software, somebody gets to point at you because it was your choice?
Little of column A, little of column B.
Right.
Up until very recently, we didn't even have levels. We're fairly small. So.
Gotcha. Cool. And Caleb?
Yeah, thanks. I'm Caleb. I go by Caleb. I'm currently at Fire Hydrant. We make incident response software. I've only been here about 5 months now. We're growing pretty quickly. Before that, I was at a cloud infrastructure consulting company for several years. And so I've worked on a lot of clients' platforms, contributing and building infrastructure in AWS and GCP, most of which, we'll talk about, but some of which I still can't share. So anyway,
okay.
But yeah.
Well, we'll poke and prod on all of the bits that we can share, and always, Caleb, wherever possible, insert a horror story from some consulting engagement that you had, because those
names will be changed to protect.
That's to protect the very, very guilty. Andy, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Andy. I'm Director of R&D and Technology at Fairwinds. I've been here for a little over three and a half years now, so a good portion of the company. And I've been operating Kubernetes in various capacities, from a just ops engineer all the way up to the level I'm at now for the last 5.5 years. So it's been my primary focus for a long time now.
And Robert, last but not least.
Hey, I'm Robert Brennan. I'm Director of Open Source here at Fairwinds. I've been at Fairwinds for a little over 2 years and working with Kubernetes for close to 3 years now.
All right, thanks. And so I had a slide that said everybody's names and titles, but I like just having people do that. So real quick, who Fairwinds is and why we're hosting this clinic. Fairwinds been in business, like I mentioned, about 6.5 years. We've been heavily focused on Kubernetes for the vast majority of that. Building and maintaining clients' infrastructures is how we got started in the industry. People say, hey, make my Kubernetes problem go away, and we build that and maintain it, have a whole bunch of automation around that. Running Kubernetes infrastructure at scale across lots and lots of companies has shown us what are the common problems that people run into when running Kubernetes. As a result, we've released a whole bunch of open source over the years to address those common problems, everything from checking for common misconfigurations, to getting resource requests right-sized, to finding out about out-of-date Helm charts or deprecated APIs and role-based access control. And I'm going to not list all of our projects, but there's a lot in there. And then in the last couple of years, we've been focusing on a SaaS software platform that brings together a lot of that open source as well as third-party open source, is heavily focused on security, policy, governance. And we'll show that briefly at the end of this, but the world that Fairwinds plays in is this Kubernetes guardrails world. And that's why we're here to talk about this today. So it's my belief that everybody would be using Kubernetes today if they believed they could use it securely, reliably, efficiently. Everyone's afraid they will use it wrong. And they want help, and they want guardrails, and they want to not screw it up. So that's why we're here, and that's what we're going to be discussing today. So we just did personal introductions, but tell us a little bit about the environment you either work in today, as much as you can share, or maybe some of the interesting ones you've fiddled with in the past. Like, are you using Kubernetes? What does it look like? Where's it running? Those kinds of things. And let's just go around the room again. So Aaron, if you want to start.
Sure. Yeah. We have a pretty simple deployment right now. We have a Kubernetes cluster per environment. I think that's pretty normal. And so we're running on Google Cloud, and we're using separate projects or the equivalent of AWS accounts to run those clusters in. Our most complex environment is actually our developer environment or review app environment. And that's because we have the capacity to deploy our internal applications on a per branch basis to individual apps in the cluster. So we've namespaced everything, made sure that we can dynamically generate those namespaces and deploy everything, spin up ingresses, do all the works there. Managing that has been interesting, but I think it's paid off in terms of developer velocity and being able to validate those changes. We started with Helm actually for everything, and really quickly learned that YAML engineering is not fun nor tenable in the long run, especially the Helm templates. It was just an extreme challenge to, I think, dynamically generate all those variables and then inject them, and then teach other engineers who are maybe not as familiar with ops and YAML to be able to generate those files and deploy Helm. So we've now switched over to Pulumi for most of our stack for deploying.
Very interesting. And let me ask a couple of clarifying questions there, Aaron, and folks, feel free to chime in if things there tweaked your interest. But you said you're running on Google. Are you in GKE, or you're not standing it up yourself?
Oh God, no. I do not trust myself to do Kubernetes the hard way, though I have read and followed along with the guide. I would rather that someone else manage that fun stuff of spinning up etcd and certificates and all that.
Yep. Okay, that makes sense. And then the other thing you said, you referred to your development environment as review app, which is a carryover from Heroku, I assume. Is that is your background fiddling with Heroku, or where did you get that terminology?
I learned the terminology from GitLab. They pushed that in their documentation, but yeah, I think it actually did come from Heroku originally.
Okay, great. Anybody questions about that before I move on?
I'm very curious how using Pulumi has gone for you. It's something I've been looking into trying out, and I'm curious, from the perspective, if you have operations engineers that are specifically dedicated to that, how they like Pulumi. I can see developers loving the concept, but I'm very curious about the other side.
Yeah, well, go ahead and answer that, Aaron.
Yeah. So I think because our hiring was pretty oriented towards engineers and not ops in the beginning, we have an engineering team of about a dozen right now, and have just now spun off into like squads of having like a platform squad, which I'm in. That having a tool like Pulumi, which is oriented towards engineers, where we have front-end engineers that write primarily TypeScript React apps that are able to contribute to and make changes to our infrastructure. That's incredible for reducing the amount of lift that's on me as the more DevOps-y oriented person on the team, to be able to ship their changes. And they can get the wonderful like type checking and all the ID features that Pulumi has to offer.
Thanks.
Okay. And Andy, any follow-up questions about I have a million questions about Pulumi and how that actually works, but we can come back to some of that, I guess. But Caleb, you want to tell us about what you're working with and or have worked with in the past, whatever you're comfortable sharing?
Yeah, totally. So we at Fire Hydrant, we also run in GKE and Google Cloud. We have a small presence in AWS, but primarily the app primarily is on GKE. It's pretty interesting to me what Aaron's talking about, the dev environments. That's a conversation we've been having. We're not currently doing that. We use Docker Compose for local development. And I think, there's a lot to be said about different tools and things like Pulumi and the AWS Kubernetes operator and that sort of thing, which I hope we do get into. But like Docker Compose is a good example because it's similar in that you're running containers, but it's not the same, and those differences matter, right? So you're not running Kubernetes locally in one way or another, or doing local development on Kubernetes, and that some of your abstractions break down when you're not doing that. And so I think that there's a lot of like nuance there in terms of tool choices that hopefully we can get into some more. And just, I mean, briefly, like in the past, my prior work as a consultant, I've worked with customers that are running EKS in AWS and they're running GKE. We had another client who's running Nomad, not running Kubernetes at all, but the Hashi stack and Nomad. And so, there again, I think it's important to have a technology focus or philosophy, right? To like sort of limit what you do and don't do as a business. But it also doesn't, I'm not sort of on the hype train of like everyone should always run Kubernetes. Like it makes sense for certain use cases. It doesn't make sense for other use cases, right? And it's
If you're
worth
hosting
doing
a
that
single
upfront.
WordPress blog, it's not the right
Yeah.
solution. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, I'll kind of pause there, I guess.
Okay. Andy, Robert, maybe Andy, you can represent some of what we do on the service side, and Robert, you can talk specifically about what our software side setup looks like.
Yeah, that makes sense because Robert is technically a customer of our managed service offering. So, I'm in a unique perspective. I get to have the unique perspective of running clusters for lots of different developers, lots of different products. So we're running across all three major clouds. We even ran an Alibaba cloud for a little while. That was a disaster. But we run in Azure, AWS, and GCP. In AWS, we run both EKS and COPS clusters because we were running clusters before EKS existed and before it was good or decent, arguable on either side of that. But and then GKE and AKS clusters as well. And our approach is really very much focused on stability and reliability. And so we don't do a lot that's super flashy or super new or on the cutting edge. We're always N-1 or 2 on Kubernetes versions. We're usually not at the very absolute latest release of each of the add-ons that we use. In that stack, we use Terraform to build our infrastructure. We have a standardized infrastructure repository layout for all of our clients, and we use Helm a lot. So we have a tool actually that is a wrapper around Helm that allows us to deploy lots of Helm charts at the same time. It's called Reckoner. We use that for our infrastructure specifically. We don't typically use that for application deployments. And then, typically I'm not involved in application deployment. It's kind of a nice place to be. We get to advise our clients on how they should deploy and, best practices they can follow, but we don't actually build out those deployments. That being said, we have helped clients build CI/CD pipelines, talk and build out, ephemeral environment deploys, as we call them, review apps, as we talked about them just before. And yeah, I think that covers most of our stack. I'll actually hand it off to Robert as a customer of ours who does some of those things we just talked about.
Yeah, so I'll talk about things from the deployment side. Luckily, as a customer of Andy's, an internal customer of Andy's, we don't have to worry about keeping Kubernetes itself up to date or worry about things like certificate management or ingress. We really just worry about how our application gets packaged up and shipped into the cluster. So we have it sounds like a pretty similar setup to what Aaron was talking about, where we basically have a review app that goes up for every branch we create of our application. We automatically ship up a review app on its own URL where we can kind of test it out. It's been, it's not the cheapest strategy. It definitely, we at any point in time can have 20 to 30 different demos kind of up and running at the same time. But it's been huge in terms of QA for us to have those at all times. And they, they're not identical to prod, but they're in the Kubernetes environment. They're running in many of the same ways that prod runs. So we've been able to catch bugs there that we wouldn't have been able to catch on our local development machines. And then in terms of how it gets up there, we use a Helm chart that we template out for both production, staging, and our all of those feature-to-feature environments. And we end up putting them in two separate clusters. We have a prod cluster, which is just production, nothing else except for Nginx ingress and all the other things that we need in there to make it functional. And then we have a staging cluster, which is a little bit more Wild West. That's where the staging app goes, which is very close to prod. It uses a permanent database, et cetera. And then all those feature deployments go in there as well. And those are a little bit more ephemeral. We reset the data every time there's a new change, that kind of thing. And it's been working really well. I mean, we're lucky enough to be able to work with some of the best SREs out there. So we've learned a lot from them. They helped us set up our deployment pipeline the first time. That's where I was introduced to the idea of review apps for the first time, and I've never turned back. It's been great.
I'd be really
Right.
curious to hear what
go ahead, Caleb.
what you use for your deployment pipelines.
We have a very, I would call it like a push-based GitOps model. So every Docker image gets tagged with the branch name, the commit hash, and any Git tags that are in there. Push all those up, and then we use an internal, or I guess it's a public open source project that Fairwinds manages called Rocket Scripts, which is basically an opinionated set of CI/CD practices for shipping an application into the cluster. But it's a pretty straightforward of build the Docker images, push them, and then apply the Helm chart.
And we do all of that in Circle.
Yeah.
With secrets coming
It's
from
helpful.
Vault now. Which
What's
is
secret
Yeah.
coming from Vault?
The secret management,
ahead,
I think, is actually one of the cooler aspects of it. Not having to give everybody access to all the secrets, but being able to manage secrets via Vault has been great. When I need to get in there and modify the secrets, I can, but it's all stored as infrastructure as code is the great thing. So we know when our secrets change, but they're all encrypted in the infrastructure as code. So there's no fear of those secrets somehow leaking out.
You're talking about HashiCorp Vault.
Yes. Yeah,
So,
we use
yeah.
Vault plus SOPs for Mozilla in order to encrypt them.
Yep.
So let's first of all, thank you. Very helpful to have sort of a high level overview so that we're all of 21 minutes in, but now we're base level set. So I want to talk about like how y'all think about what access do you give to people? What access don't you give to people? What are the ways that everyone? How do I say this? At Fairwinds, we have been managing infrastructure for a long time across lots of different companies that are in crazy different verticals, right? And we do have to reevaluate where those lines are for different organizations at different times. But we're always thinking about what do we let people do and what don't we let people do, right? Because we get paged in the middle of the night if things break. And we don't want that to happen, right? So just spend a minute, like Aaron, where do you draw lines? And that could be anywhere from the access you give to how much guidance you give on provisioning to like where do you tell your people what they need to own and what they don't, and where do you have an opinion?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, we're in a regulated industry and have to maintain HIPAA compliance. So for us, that means that we do have some guardrails in terms of we've used Google Cloud IAM roles to make sure that not everyone can just turn on any service. We do have to have like a review process to make sure that falls into the supported compliance list. Same for external products. There's a whole process that we have to do in order to work with a third-party vendor. However, within those guardrails, though, we use infrastructure as code for almost all of our deployment. So our engineering team is enabled to make changes to our monorepo. We store everything in one repository, and with review processes, push a merge request, have it be reviewed, and push that out and have it go up through our deploy pipeline, and then we check. We have gated checks at review, staging, and production to verify that our tests pass and things like that. In terms of those permissions, like within the Kubernetes realm, I think it's we're not using cluster role bindings or anything like that. We're basically deploying almost everything through GitLab at that point.
Interesting. So do your teams have access to view pieces of the cluster to figure out what happened, what went wrong when things do go wrong, or do you have other things in place that give them that access?
Yeah, so we do give our team access through the Kubernetes API as well as through the Google Cloud Console to view cluster resources, debug things, logs, metrics, all those fun things. One thing I didn't mention though is in terms of guardrails. One thing the thing that keeps me up at night more than a lot of other things are the supply chain vulnerabilities that have been exploited industry-wide for the past several years. And it was actually about 2.5 years ago that I first instituted egress filtering on all of our namespaces. So we use network policies. I think it's backed by Calico CNI by default on GKE. And we use network policies to ensure that all of our pods, all of our applications, their egress traffic is limited to specific IPs or host names. And then we have had to like stand up like forward proxies, Nginx forward proxies in our cluster in order to be able to do host name level out egress filtering. That's probably been one of the more challenging aspects of deploying is it's a fairly common issue. Once you have a lot of network policies, it's really easy to deploy something new, a new service or a new connection, and then find that it doesn't work. And the diagnostics there are not great. Just connections or sockets just fail to connect. And that's a bit of a challenge to debug.
That was going to be my immediate question. Like,
yeah.
What is the failure scenario like? How do you debug it? Because yeah, like that low level blocking is, there often isn't even a log of a sort, right?
Yeah. GKE does not give visibility into when a network policy blocks an egress connection. And I understand they're rolling out something called Data Plane v2. So they're rolling out their own container networking interface, I think it is, CNI. And that is supposed to provide more visibility into what's going on with network policies, but it is a bit of a black box and it does make it a bit of a challenge to deploy new infra.
Any other questions on that before we move on?
Do you do anything in terms of like network and team segmentation, like the GCP best practices for enterprise orgs? I think you're nodding your head, I know.
Yeah, so we are using, for example, the private APIs functionality to make sure that we are keeping our traffic inside of Google's VPC. We are not following, Google has, what Caleb was mentioning is Google has some really elaborate Terraform modules out there that will stand up a project or maybe dozens of projects. We are not following those to the letter. It's a little overkill, I think, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's a great example of a large Terraform configuration with a set of modules. Well, it's an example of modules, not the deployments themselves. But even leaving aside the Terraform, like Google Enterprise Best Practices is this document that they publish, and it covers this very detailed team segmentation approach. And it makes a lot of sense. It's a good place to inform your design decisions, but it's almost always going to be overkill in terms of structural engineering in my experience.
Yeah, I think in my experience, when reading best practices, especially enterprise best practices, you need to right size those for the size of the team and the company that you're at. There are Google scale problems that can be solved by Google scale configuration. When I started out deploying this cluster, we were just one full-time engineer, a couple contractors, and that was not the right solution for the amount of manpower that we had, people power that we had. So we've omitted or passed over some of those. We do maintain like some blast radius features in our cluster though, now that we're starting to segment out parts of our application and who the audience is or what squad is building that feature.
There's always going to be size and scale specific problems and specific solutions, and Google is a little infamous for coming up with the most impressive engineering solution to a problem nobody but Google has. So knowing, you know, what is best practice and what is best practice for a company your size are a little bit two different things. Especially when you're talking about a minimum viable product early on, let alone, you know, when you have 10 users versus 100 million users. Caleb,
Yeah,
it looked like you're going to say something else. Yeah, go for it.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is something we kept seeing, you know, when I was working as a consultant, and you know, I mean, there's generally at least some level of awareness that, yeah, like not everyone's Google. You don't need to operate like Google. You're also not a huge corporation, but like it's really even kind of more granular than that, right? Like the solution that works at your small startup scale probably needs to evolve when you're, you know, 50 or 100 people, and that solution then isn't the same when you're 1,000 and more and that sort of thing. And like it sort of inherently has to evolve and change at different scales. And you know, org structure and platform, like your software structure, like your org, none of that's a new concept, right? But you know, the idea that like there isn't even just the startup scale and the enterprise scale. There's, you know, several steps or set points, I think. And yeah, a lot of what we ended up doing with, for example, with that enterprise best practices from Google is, you know, sort of collapsing the different roles, right? You know, you might have a network admin role and a security admin role, or more likely those are the same role and that sort of thing. And if you're, you know, the first engineer at a 10-person company, you're all of those roles, and that's totally understandable, right? Yeah.
I mean, but how much would those enterprise scale best practices be easy to implement, or would they be more broadly implemented if they were easy to implement, right? Like part of it is you have to be at a certain scale because you almost need someone to full-time run X, Y, or Z process before you can do it. But if it was easy to do, you'd pull some of those triggers because you like the idea of the controls. You just don't have the manpower or the ability to focus on it. People power, to Friel's point.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's where the friction comes in, right? Is that if you have security and network and developer segmentation, then you have to go ask your buddy for the permissions and whatnot. I do think like you can still structure your Terraform, or however you're defining this, you can do it in a way that later you'll be able to break those out, right? Like you might have those roles defined, and right now they're all mapped to one person or one team and that sort of thing. But later when the team split, you know, you're already there, versus having like, you know, if you go in and you give individual users logins, you know, set up permissions at the individual user level, it's a huge headache later to then go back and remap that to group membership and that sort of thing.
So, Caleb, you're getting into a little bit of where I want to go next, like particularly maybe when you've been a consultant in the past. Where are the places that some of these guardrails have gone off the rails? Things have gone off the rails. Somebody has gotten more permission than they should have, or the setup was, the guardrails were put in place poorly enough that it took forever to rip out and change later on. You know, give a couple of examples of that.
Oh gosh, yeah.
Give us all the examples of that.
I don't know how much time we have, but yeah, I think, you know, one really common sort of pattern, like it's not a habit, right, that becomes a failure scenario is, you know, if you SSH to prod or you kubeexec to prod, and that becomes a part of the deployment workflow. And you might even currently have, you know, monitoring and alerting set up for that, and yet it happens, and it happens routinely. And, you know, you get to a point a year from now or whenever, when you need to put those guardrails, really lock them down. And lo and behold, your developers like built that into their deployment workflow, right? It's the obligatory XKCD, right? Is one person's bug is another person's feature or something of the sort, right?
Yeah, I think what Caleb is getting at is there's this contention in the security community with tools like Kubernetes, where obviously it's to the benefit of these cloud platforms to make it really easy to have a quick start, that you get into deploying an application, you can debug it really quickly. It all just kind of works more or less just like running a local program, some fancy stuff that you put before, kubectl exec or kubectl run. But then trying to take that away and institute proper security controls, it can become a sort of a Sisyphean task to try and institute those once you already have processes built around. For example, it was a wise move 2.5 years ago to institute those egress filters. To do that now, if we had not already had those in place, it would have taken ages to validate the application that we make sure that we're doing everything correctly. I would love to see GKE or EKS or whatever come out with a sort of like a guardrails already enabled version that you can deploy, that you like the production version of your cluster that just turns off a lot of the things that you don't really want people doing in prod, because those things are kind of risky and dangerous, and they introduce toil and challenges later on that are much, much larger and much more intractable later.
I think that's what GKE is attempting to do with autopilot.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're so spot on. Like there's so many pieces there that I think make for great failure scenarios. I will say really briefly that like the AWS guardrails, I think, do a decent job of giving you kind of an a la carte approach to that. It borders on like, oh, you're going to put everything into control tower and landing zone, which is usually too much overkill. But I think that there's a decent balance there. But yeah, I mean, to your point, Aaron, I think of it as like the getting started guides for everything out there, right? Including GKE and EKS and probably AKS, which I'm not familiar with, but I think of it as like the uncanny valley. There's like the getting started guide, and then there's some material out there for deep experts and enterprise, and there's nothing in between, right? And so you get your cluster spun up, and then you spend the next 3 years sort of in that valley wondering, like, as an organization, wondering what to do.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, well, that's a good point, but I'm curious, like Andy, you've helped or seen companies all along in that journey, from the biggest enterprise down to the smallest little things. What does that middle valley look like?
It's vast. No, I mean, you're not wrong. There's an incredible amount that you can do and an incredible amount that you shouldn't do there. And honestly, I'm not sure how I answer your question directly, Kendall, but like, I don't know how a lot of companies make it through there without some sort of major incident happening and without professional, help from the outside or somebody embedded deeply in that really truly understands Kubernetes. I think there was an article a long while back that kept circulating around that was basically the true cost of running Kubernetes, I think it was, and it was basically like you need 2 or 3 full-time SREs just focused on Kubernetes to really run Kubernetes. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that valley is huge. It's massive, and crossing it is not easy.
But and I think again, like Aaron is kind of alluded to, get it right early on, spend that time up front, because it's so much more difficult later to refactor your Terraform, to migrate your production clusters and things like that. And you know, it's what you said, Aaron, right? Like if you had tried to add that egress filtering now, it would have been so much harder, right? Yeah.
I would definitely agree with you. The hard part is like, how, I mean, most companies, how do you do it right early on, right? I love the idea of autopilot and things, hopefully, we see more like it where we really turn those knobs down on what you can do with Kubernetes. One of the things I love that autopilot does is it automatically, you put in a CPU memory request. You have to. There's an admission controller that requires you to. And then that request automatically becomes your limit. Is that the best solution for all of your applications? No, not necessarily, but it will prevent a lot of pain for a lot of people just starting out in Kubernetes, scaling their applications. You know, a cluster auto scaling is automatically turned on, and in combination with those resource requests and limits, and the node pools being managed, now you've got a cluster that can automatically fit your workload. I'm sure people will find a way to shoot themselves in the foot with that in a different way going forward, but I love the concept, and I think things like that will become important.
Even with a nail gun that has a lot of protections, people still shoot themselves in the foot. I think it's funny that you mentioned that specifically, Andy, because anytime I talk to a customer who's been using Kubernetes for 2 or 3 years and has never enabled auto scaling, I'm like, why? Like, what's the promise of the cloud if you have to do it all manually? Why are you here? There's a surprising number of people who just never even get there, and it seems like base level stuff. But okay, follow-up questions on that before I move on. I'm appreciating the banter. I think it's good, but trying to keep the discussion keep moving. So next thing I want to ask is, and by the way, I should pause and say for the audience, if you have questions that you want to ask, you're welcome to drop them in. There is a Q&A thing at the bottom. You're welcome to ask questions there. We'll either get to them in the middle of the discussion or towards the end, but feel free to pop something in there if you have questions. Talk a little bit about, we're talking about guardrails in general around a lot of things, and a lot of this is related to configuration or access controls. But how do you think about security at your organization? And Friel, I know you live in a highly regulated organization. Some regulation is directly related to security. Some of it is more just like, I guess access is security, but I think of it a little different. I don't know. How are you all thinking about security at your organization, and what are you doing inside of Kubernetes? Does it go all the way down to the kernel level of every container, or do you keep it at, our VPC is secure, so we're fine?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. HIPAA is widely known as being notoriously vague on a number of points regarding security. So following security best practices like the CIS lists and SOC and SOC 1 and SOC 2 implementation guides is really kind of a good starting point. Making sure that you implement things like mandatory access controls and make sure that you're not using shared user accounts, right? Like you should be able to attribute everything that a user does in your cloud environment back to an individual person who's making that action. Those are really critical, not just from a security perspective, but our compliance and auditing perspective. I think that in terms of how I think about security, it comes back to starting with like a fairly locked down environment and trying to implement those best practices as soon as possible. The trouble is finding those best practices. It's things like issuing security keys, hardware tokens to users that have highly privileged levels of access. I wish there was more of a sort of standard, like, here's how to do security guide for not just folks like myself in this role, but also for founders and for the C-levels to be able to see, like, what are the things that you should be asking your teams? What should they be doing? And what are they not doing in terms of security best practices?
Yeah, there again, like the lack of guidance, documents, and reference material. There's a real struggle. Like it's a on the one hand you have like these enterprise best practices, and they're more work than a large team could accomplish in a reasonable amount of time, let alone a small team. So, there again, like, what's the middle ground? Can you go through, the NIST guidance or the CIS benchmarks and sort of stack rank them and say, like, well, these are the must-haves and these are the nice-to-haves and these are like the do later things. One thing that I have to keep reminding myself is that there's awesome lists for everything. And so, when I'm looking at, like, what do we want to do for CI/CD, or what do we want to do for container security or Kubernetes security, I can go to the GCP docs because we're on GCP, but I can also go to the AWS docs and I can look at the Azure docs and I can just search like awesome lists, SecOps or whatnot. And I don't know that there's been a time where I haven't found one, and that, like, it's worth doing that background reading and that, that set, like, documentation requirements gathering up front, because again, like Aaron's saying, you don't necessarily, it's not obvious which things are required and which are just nice to have. And there's a lot of resources out there, but you have to remember to, like, go find them. And it's very easy to say, like, well, I'm using Terraform and I'm using GCP, so I'm going to go read those docs and just that. That's one thing that I found really useful, to just keep reminding myself, like, awesome lists. Seriously, find an awesome list for anything, like compliance or regulatory or whatnot.
Yeah.
Robert, what were you gonna? Oh, sorry, Aaron. Sorry.
No worries. I was going to give a quick shout out to, I want to repeat what Caleb said about awesome lists, like searching GitHub for awesome blank. The community has produced incredibly detailed sets of resources, and the pull request model for adding stuff is amazing. Beautiful work by various community contributors there. I also want to give a shout out to kas.af. As a great resource for people getting started with Kubernetes, just like reading basically the failure stories of other people, some fairly large corporations running Kubernetes in production and encountering things. Just incredible stuff there, and a valuable resource.
It's also reassuring, right? I've been listening to the On the Metal podcast, and they, their little line is like, "You're not alone." Reading Kate's.af is kind of like that too. It's like, oh, admission controllers are hard. Oh, okay, thanks. Good to know.
What were you going to add to that, Robert?
So I was just going to say, we talked a little bit about, the different compliance standards out there. We just went through SOC 2 internally, and I'll say at the beginning of the process, I was kind of rolling my eyes about how vague some of the stuff was, and it felt like, we were just going to be checking a bunch of boxes. But once we actually started looking at them and interpreting them, in the context of our own environment, the services we use, the fact that we're on Kubernetes, it really did force us to think about a lot of things that we might not have thought about otherwise. And I think we have a much better security profile for having gone through that exercise. And I was very skeptical at the beginning, and now I'm like a true believer in those compliance standards.
But I will add to that, like, just looking at the SOC 2 compliance, controls is not helpful. Like, it's a loose guide, but we partnered with another company that really, like, worked with us to be specific to our environment and provided controls and checks and things like that we were able to implement that made it a lot easier. So working with those companies can provide that guidance that is missing, as far as, like, I think the information's all out there, but you need the guidance as to, what do I do first? What's, like, the low hanging fruit? Well, SOC 2 is probably the low hanging fruit of compliance, right? So, like, go after that. Even if you're not going to get an audit done, maybe partner with a company that does that sort of thing and is familiar with those and can walk you through those steps of, these are the controls you should implement. And that could be super helpful.
Like a systematized framework to think through things is a big part of what the value is there. So
yeah, and another thing I was going to add, kind of my actual answer to your question, Kendall, is that I think it's useful to think in terms of models like the OSI model, like think in terms of layers of the stack. as well as boundaries and perimeters. You know, there's this very flashy modern idea of zero trust. And there again, you know, you can go deeply down that rabbit hole of how Google does it. But the key, like the distillation of that, right, is where are your boundaries? Where are the perimeters? What is, you know, is there a sense of inside and outside? And if you think like in terms of the OSI model or some similar leaky abstraction, like we have hardware and we have, you know, compute and we have network, and like to Friel's point, Aaron's point, the supply chain poisoning, you know, that may come through third-party packages that you're installing, or it might come through die manufacturing at the hardware layer, right? And you know, some of that is deeply scary. But again, you know, you look at the different layers in the model and you ask, like, what are the priorities? What are the must-haves? And that's where you start. Like, we have a calendar quarter, and we need to reach SOC compliance. Like, what is the must-haves, right? So don't boil the ocean, right?
Mm-hmm.
How hot is the ocean already when we get started? How
Yeah.
big is our burner?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to piggyback on that. And one challenge when following these, you know, SOC or CIS top 20 guides or whatever, is a lot of this stuff is information that was dated 10, 20 years ago for threat models that were valid 10 or 20 years ago. As working in the health tech industry, I'll get vendor security assessments that ask us about how many file shares do we have on the network, how many you know, Windows servers 2003 are we running, and the answer is 0. We're running none. We're
floppy disks.
We are definitely secure there. We're not letting anyone connect to our file shares because we don't have any. But that, I think there needs to be some updating of this language, and I think it needs to come not just from the parent organizations, SOC, and but also I think government agencies are starting to now update their documentation and guidance, and it hasn't fully trickled down. I think finance and health are two areas where it takes a little bit longer for best practices to get into those fields. So that's been a challenge. I think communicating like what we should do in terms of security when there's guidance out there that's fairly antiquated or not adequate for the threats that we face today.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I will say, I wanted to mention that there was a recent talk from HashiConf. I think the talk is called Pillars of Zero Trust. And you know, the work that HashiCorp is doing around boundary is, I think, the modern version of a lot of this, right? It's the restatement of these decades old requirements. But that talk in particular, I think, does a really good job of giving you a mental model, a framework for, you know, how to approach access and access control. It's like machine to machine, human to machine, human to human, and it goes from there. So
Yeah. Well, so I gotta change direction here, and we'll come back. And I want to, Caleb and Friel, also be able to point people at where they can find you on the internet if they have follow-up questions and want to hear more from you. But so don't let me forget that. But I'm gonna pause and pivot to we're having this discussion because this is what Fairwinds does. We build Guardrails software for Kubernetes, and I'm just going to show you that real quickly. I'm going to share my screen. There's a lot in this software, and we're not going to be able to get into all of it, so I'm just going to try to whet the appetite for folks that are watching. So when you log into Fairwinds Insights, we give you an overview. I'm in an organization with 2 clusters. I'm going to click into a cluster. And this cluster we give a big overview to. So we show in different action items we're introduced to the cluster. We give an overall health score on how the cluster's doing. And to the point we were discussing earlier, how do you prioritize? What is the high priority things? What aren't? We do some of that for you, danger versus warning items. And I'll get into some of that in a second. We track your health score over time, so you can see if you're improving. This cluster's gotten a little bit better over time. We have some cost analysis. This one is pretty static because we use it for demos and it doesn't actually change that much. But to give some of the meat of what's going on here is in these action items. So I've got, this cluster has 174 action items right now. I'm gonna make this a lot bigger so you can see we have warning items versus danger items. You can click into any one of these and it's going to tell you what the problem is in your cluster and how to go about fixing it. And then it's also telling you which report this is coming from. You can see Kubernetes is in here, Trivy. I'll show you where all the reports are that we're drawing on. There is the ability to say this is working as intended, or you're not going to fix it. You can assign a ticket to somebody or create a ticket or assign it to somebody. We also show you when it was first seen, last reported, etc. You can sort by namespace and resource level. And again, there's a lot here. I can't show all of it to you. If I go into the reports, where we're getting all of this, so I mentioned we build a lot of open source. So Polaris is our tool. It's open source. You can run on any cluster that shows you the common misconfigurations we see in Kubernetes clusters. Now we've paired Polaris with Nova, which looks for Helm charts that are out of date, Pluto checking for deprecated APIs, Goldilocks helping you get your resource requests just right. These are all Fairwinds projects, but we also pull in Trivy, third-party best-in-class open source, checking for container vulnerabilities, Kubebench, KubeHunter, KubeSec. These are not our tools, but we're helping you operationalize them at scale across lots of clusters. And then we finally also have support for open policy agents. So if you want to write custom policy, that's built into here as well. So I showed you there's a whole bunch of action items there, but like, let's be honest, as an ops world, we don't want a billion action items that we have to go slowly sort through. So we've shifted a lot of that responsibility left. Here's a common workflow. An engineer's going to be pushing code in GitHub. Here's Robert doing some crazy things, trying to run a container as root and add insecure permissions to the container. And you can see Circle has passed all of our tests, but Fairwinds Insights has failed it. And so you can click into this. The average engineer is going to need to click into this and in the UI see, oh, I shouldn't be running this as privileged. And it's going to tell them how to go about fixing it. So there's a lot here. There's also, we have integrations with Datadog, with Slack, with Jira. You can write custom policy and we have templates that you can go kick something out. There's integration at the CI level, at the admission controller level, and on and on and on. And finally, there's one other piece I'm going to show. Oh, if I can find it. And that's just, we do some cost optimization, and this is around getting those resource requests and limits right. And so, here's a cluster with your daily cost broken down by workload. And you can click into any of these and it'll tell you with recommendations what you should change. So we'll actually tell you sometimes these workloads are under provisioned. And if you take our recommendations, the cost is actually going to increase. Again, 56 cents per month is not going to change a dramatic thing, but some of these workloads at scale, if you have many, many, many pods running, is going to save you a lot of money in a significant way. You can click into this and it says, here's what you're requesting. Here's what we think you should request. So there's a whole lot here. I can't go into the entire platform, but if your company is looking at guardrails around Kubernetes, this is what Fairwinds Insights exists to solve. There's a SaaS version, a self-hosted version, and any kind of environment you're in, whether it's looking for compliance or something else, we probably have something that's relevant to you. So if you want just a general Kubernetes best practices, there's also this white paper you can go check out on our website. And we're gonna wrap up here, but I wanna ask Friel and Caleb, and we can come back to our folks too, but where can folks find you on the internet if they want to hear more about what you're doing? And you're clearly smart people, and obviously they want to come and ask you help desk related questions. So where can someone do that?
Excellent question. Yeah, I don't really maintain an active Twitter or anything like that anymore. I guess I am on Twitter as Aaron Friel. Also, folks can email me at mayreply@aaronfriel.com, and it does what it says on the tin.
May reply. Caleb? Probably just LinkedIn is going to be the best place to find me. There's not a whole lot of Calebides out there. So yeah, you should be able to find me there.
Okay. And Andy, Robert, you want to make a plug for y'all individually?
Yeah, you can find me at @HarbRunDev on Twitter or in the Fairwinds community Slack.
Yeah, Fairwinds community Slack, Kubernetes Slack, RAND Slack, Lots of Slack. LinkedIn's good. I am Suderman Jr. or Suderman Jr. everywhere that you might want to find me.
Yeah, and also, feel free to hit us up at Fairwinds if any of this looked interesting to you. And really appreciate Caleb and Friel. Appreciate you joining us. And thanks, folks, for joining. There will be a recording of this sent out afterwards. So
Thanks a lot.
have a great day.